Hey, Michael, thank you for coming in. I mean, you just have an incredible background of success and resilience and hard work and determination and really spanning every aspect of what makes you just an outstanding servant leader and capital allocator as well, but just in general, in many different aspects. You are sort of the elite, the epitome, the model for the rest of the world. So thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with my audience.
I might need to carry you in my pocket to be my hype man. I need that introduction all the time.
So, Michael, what were those three inflection points that made you who you are today? And it could have been when you were 3 or 5 years old. It could have been challenges and other opportunities. Um, and it could have been mentors throughout your life, things like that. So, what are the maybe the three pivotal points that created this amazing individual you are?
Yeah, I'll turn back the clock, and sometimes it's just easy, as Steve Jobs says, to connect the dots looking back. But I think at a young age, I grew up in a city, and when you grow up in a city, you're probably more inclined to just like pick up some level of sports or athleticism because like that's what's available to you. And I grew up playing baseball and had just a deep love for it at such a young age. And I remember specifically my younger brother, who's just a natural athlete, like the kind of guy that can like jump out of the gym without even trying. Um, he was the number one pick in our little league trap. And, me as the older brother, like I got a little sour about it. And like, no, I'm supposed to be the number one pick. Like I'm your older brother. And, I'm like crying. And I go to my dad, who's like a pretty old school traditional guy. And, I'm like wiping my eyes and it's like, well, what's wrong? I'm like, well, I'm supposed to be the number one pick. And he's like, well, are you gonna like cry about it? Essentially. And I said no, and I wiped my eyes. And so fast forward to my birthday, I'm going to his car and expecting a gift. And like at a young age, you're just like maybe looking for a video game or I don't know. And he opens the trunk of his car and like I'm looking at the objects and I'm like, I don't see any gift. And there was just a bunch of books and they were baseball books, they were pitching books. And just something that I'll remember for the rest of my life is that I read these books and instantly saw progress in my skills and ability. And they were very minor tweaks. And you've probably heard the analogy of like in golf, if you like tear off just a little bit, how like the long tail of that just is like hundreds of yards. Like that's how it felt for me that no one had picked up that I was holding a baseball incorrectly to throw with more velocity. And like simply by changing the grip and holding it properly, like I saw like a step function and velocity. And I'm like, holy smokes, like how many other things in life are like this, where I'm just a little off. And if I had the right information, the right data, like what else could that apply to? And I saw my skills improve and it just kind of made me someone who loved to get what I perceive as the best information. And I feel like if you can get really close to people that are performing the best, like I don't need to be the guy that like comes up with this new way to do something, like just mirror and mimic the best. And yeah, put your own flavor and twist on it, right? It's still got to feel like you. I would extend that caveat. But again, like most things have been done. If you could like mirror and mimic the technique and the effort, usually you'll yield a comparable result. So I'd say that was the first one. And it was really amazing to just like take on that kind of leadership role, which it felt like to me as a pitcher, because like so much is in your control as a pitcher. And it's a good and a bad thing. I like control. I know that about myself. And in some ways, like the game starts and stops with you. And it becomes a little bit more of a mental game than a physical game at times, which I felt like gave me an advantage versus somebody who may have, a stronger or more capable physical stature or athletic ability. And that part of my life played out where, my brother and I, we were pitcher and catcher. So we had like this really fun, connection where I'd like kind of know what he wanted and vice versa. And we wound up bringing like the first city championship back to the Bronx in like 45 years where we grew up, which was a lot of fun. And fast forward to high school, like all I cared about was playing baseball. And I had to take 3 buses each way each day to get to school. And yeah, then I had baseball practice, then I'd come home and I'd just like do it again, rinse and repeat. So there wasn't much time for me to think about anything else at that stage of my life. And I dedicated everything I had to it. Like the downtime that I had was basically for homework and like watching Major League Baseball just as an observer. And come junior year, kind of how it works in baseball, and it's changed now because like all sports and sports science has changed a ton since I was playing. But you kind of would go on this circuit where like junior year was like really the most important year if you wanted to play like at the next level, which I aspired to. And so, I'm having a great junior season and really just one pitch of which I specifically remember, like I felt the difference after that. It changed everything. And I needed Tommy John surgery, which is much more common here today than it was back then. But everything just flipped upside down. And like I remember, at the age of 17, just like trying to figure out who I was. Because I like unfortunately put like this dagger in baseball at the time. I'm like, okay, well, this is done. Like people don't really come back from this. And people do now. But I really got into a place of like, who am I? Like, what's my identity without baseball? And it was like a dark couple of days for me where I'm just like moseying around the house and like have my hoodie tucked all the way down and don't really want to be seen or heard. And again, it just kind of came from this absence of like having a purpose at the time, and everything was dedicated towards that. So it wound up being a really amazing thing. And again, this goes back to being able to see it looking back, where because I had this surgery, I was in physical therapy, and most like teenagers, you would get a job that's almost like manual labor at the time, like you do some landscaping or you're a lifeguard or something like that. And because I had this injury and like I didn't have full range of motion and all this stuff, I like needed a role that would enable me to like not do something physical and would also give me flexibility to like prioritize this physical therapy I was going through. And so I wound up getting a call, and a lot of like college students get this, but I was just graduating high school to do like direct sales, which again, people have had experiences all over the spectrum. And I know it's not for everybody, but it was really formative for me. And so I wound up working for vector marketing and sold Cutco cutlery. That was like a huge part of my development as a person. And by the way, if you want me to keep going, I can pause. I don't know what makes sense. I'll rip it if you don't pause me.
Well, let's go back, right? And you had this sort of dynamic with your brother, right? You're both athletes, in fact, really, really great athletes, and you go to your dad, and and he gives you these books, but I think it's really interesting. When you read the books, you discovered that these just little minute and fine tuning can have a huge dramatic effect in terms of your skill capability. And it opened up this whole idea that if you fine tune, if you have the resilience and you're willing to be adaptable, you can make these adjustments and then perform at an elite level. But you have to be willing to be curious to make those adjustments, right? And what you're sharing too is that you very much have this kind of internal locus of control, which means you look to yourself for the improvement. You look to yourself to make the fine tuning and things like that. And you're willing to do that analysis or internal locus of control or this agency and that self agency and identity and this self-motivation and almost like Angela Duckworth's grit, you know? So you're combining all of those and you realize this at a foundational edge or age. And I think that's just really fascinating that you had the wherewithal to do that, even though you, when you got the injury and you were doing rehab, let's say 3 times a week, and it required a lot of commitment, you knew enough that, you know what, I'm going to put myself into a situation where I'm going to challenge it because direct sales is not easy. Again, guys, it's self-agency, it's internal locus of control. You determine the outcome, and it's being adaptable and hard work, and you're adding another layer, and that layer is on the human side, starting to understand human behavior. Because when you do direct sales, you have to understand the other, and what motivates them when you're going to sell. And in fact, you become the top salesperson in the country, and you break records and things like that, and which speak. And so we'll go to that. But your dad, to open up the trunk of his car, and he had these books on pitching. So what aspect of it sounds like your dad was really into sports as well and things like that. Can you maybe know or?
No, like it's still the oddest thing to me because I don't think my dad has read a book since elementary school. So it's not like he's an avid reader. He dropped out of high school in 3 days, and he doesn't like sports. He doesn't follow sports. Like he doesn't know anything that's going on in sports. But I really don't know what like posed him to, or prompted him, I should say, to do that. And I think really he wanted to see me excel. He always wants to see me excel. And I think it's just my dad has always, and I think sometimes this happens with parents, right? Like you want your children ideally to live a better life than you've lived, and you want them to have more than you had, and you want to be able to afford them the things that are better in this world. And I think something that feels really aligned in that element is education. And so like my dad did do whatever he could to give me the best of what was even possible for his status. And I do think about this a lot. And it's why the internet is like a great equalizer. Is like most people can't grow past what they have exposure to. And you and I had that conversation the first time that we spoke, but I'll dive into that later in the call. When I moved to San Francisco at the time, like I had no exposure to so much of the information and content that people out there had exposure to. And that was just like table stakes for them. It wasn't like something that like everybody kind of had some of these same ideologies, philosophies. And for me, I was like, whoa, like this is like what everybody knows. But I'll add one thing, and I think about this a lot, is it's like one of my biggest envies amongst like really young people is when you're like a kid, you're not really thinking about failure that much. Like if you go and pick up a baseball, you're not like, am I throwing it right? You're just throwing it. And like that freedom to not judge yourself and just do it, right, is so liberating. And then like as we get older, like this ego begins to develop, and like you're almost too scared to take any action at the thought of failure. And I know I experience that now where sometimes like if I don't do something like as to my standards the first time, I'm just like, oh, I'm never going to be good at this, you know? Well, and like, that's just not how life works. And I have to remind myself of like, dude, why did you think you're going to be good at this the first time that you ever did it? Like, that's just not how life works. But when you're a kid, it's just like, none of those things are really crossing your mind in the same fashion. And like, I think when you have experienced a level of success in any vertical, like it tends to bleed over in confidence in other areas, and the two aren't necessarily correlated. So I do have that thought a lot.
So, you join Cutco and Vector Marketing, and they use college students, right? And it's commission-based sales. And you actually made a claim, though, right? You said, you know what, I'm going to be the top salesperson, and it didn't quite work out initially, but it did. Can you go over that story? Because some people, when they make a claim and then They don't make it on the first try. And this speaks to the resilience, right? To keep going at it. Can you tell it? Because I think it's a great story.
Yeah, and I'm gonna actually back up the truck a little further on that cocktail experience because I think it's really easy to like for me to draw a straight line to like some of the like, highest accolades that I achieved. But when I first started, that was like not the case for me. And like in my own training class, a lot of people got off to a faster start than I did. And something you asked about like formative experiences in my life, I was like really lucky to have an amazing first mentor professionally. And one of the key traits that this man possessed was that he saw me bigger than I saw myself. And I think when you're young, or you just look up to someone, when they can see you for who you are and who you can be, rather than where you are in this moment, like sometimes you borrow that confidence. It's like, well, I think that person is really smart and he sees this in me, so maybe there's something there, right? And I think at like 18 years old, like, you like have this image of yourself, but like for me, it was just all baseball related. So anything outside of baseball, like I didn't have that much confidence in. And so my first summer, and this was such a valuable lesson in life. They're in the company, they have these things called push periods. And it's just like this fabricated way to have you sell more, but like they build it up. It's like the Super Bowl and like everybody goes all in. And so just for perspective, I had been working for 2 months prior. And in that 2 month period, I had sold around $7,000, which isn't like lighting the world on fire by any means. There are a lot of people who like excelled at a much faster clip than I did. And then this push period comes, and part of this objective of the company is like to have people like stretch themselves and pursue goals that they never had before. And so during this push period, it's like an 18-day window. You commit to the process of the push period. You commit to the activity of just like the rules where you're either on a demo, trying to set a demo, or in the office. Like, can you commit to that for 18 days? And those three things seem simple enough to commit to, but obviously there's things that go into it. But the goal that they had me pursue was $10,000 in 18 days when I had sold 7,000 in 2 months prior. And so like my mind was like, how is that going to happen? Right? Like there's just no way that I can like outperform my prior results in this shorter window of time. And at the time when I was entering this like, 18-day window, I felt like I had the least amount of leads that I'd ever had because I like burned them all. So I'm like, I already used my best options. Like I don't have anything in the holster necessarily to like go and pursue this goal. And so I committed to the activity. And funny enough, I remember I got this feedback from this first mentor, who was still very much himself figuring it out at that point. But I think one thing that happens when you're like a high school student specifically, this feedback has been shared a lot, is that you just take and follow directions pretty well. Like because you live this structured life, like that was the case for me, where like I kind of just like did what I was told. And so like if you gave me like the blueprint for how to do something, like the least I could do is at least follow the blueprint. And like in so many of these sales type scenarios, like if you just follow the outline of things that have worked in the past, you're probably going to receive some similar level of success. And so I remember I walked up to my manager and I'm like, hey, how do you sell $10,000 in 18 days? And he goes, you start by making 300 phone calls right now. And he told me that my response was, okay. And I just turned back to my seat and I just did it. And like, I didn't think about it because I was like, well, if this is how you do it, right? Like, this is how you do it. And I think now I might like look back and be like, I don't want to make 300 phone calls right now. But like at the time, I just followed the directions. And so there was this moment, even leading up to the story that you're speaking of, where a really big transformative moment in my life was the number one student in the nation. I saw him on stage, and he had just sold like $30,000 in the month of January. And again, that same mentor of mine was sitting next to me. He's like, "You could be him." And I'm like, "Really? You think so? Like, you see that in me?" And so as soon as that guy got off stage, I was like, okay, this guy's probably got some super secret silver bullet special sauce that I like got to know about. And I'm like, "Hey, I want you to mentor me. I want to like take calls with you and like learn under your wing." And so I took some of these calls with him, and I don't mean to say this in a diminishing way, but like I was so unimpressed. I was like, this guy, like this is the guy who got this results. Like, and then I grew more confident. I'm like, if this guy can do it, like I actually do think that I can do it. And fast forward, I decided after that person had set the record for what I wanted to pursue that I was going to pursue it too. And not just break his record, but like try and set the company record, which was like $55,000 in the month of January. And so I wound up pursuing that the first time. And I sold $30,000 in the month of January, which like by all accounts in that context was still exceptional. Like I was still like the number one student in the nation. But I wound up feeling like such a failure because I'm like, oh my God, I like fell short of my goal by like 40%. Like that is just kind of disgraceful. Like, like I felt a lot of shame and embarrassment because like one of the things that they try and have you do in that setting is like create some level of public accountability. And I think that's good in some ways, and in other ways, maybe it's not so good. But like I felt like I gave all these people my word that I was going to do this. And like, the truth is, no one probably cares that much. But like, at least to me, I was like, oh my God, like I got to follow through on this. And then when I fell so short of my goal, like I was really discouraged because like I did try my hardest at the time. And I like left no stone unturned. Like I exerted max effort. And so in my head, I was like, this is just not possible for me because I know that I gave this 100% of what I could give right now. It wasn't like I didn't have any remorse on the fact that my effort was there. And so that was the first time, like while working at that company, where I like even thought about just not doing this anymore because I was like, oh my God, like if I can't achieve that goal, like who am I even? Like, and I feel horrible because I felt so short. Like I feel like a failure. It's just weird how that works, right? Where like you can do something that's like by all accounts really impressive or like compared to the rest of the field, really just above the rest of people, at least sales is measurable in that way. And just feel like, wow, I'm a failure. Like I'm like a loser. Like all those thoughts were like swimming through my head at the time. I don't know if there's anything to say on that, but I can fast forward a little bit too.
Yeah, in your original manager, that's a sim, right? Or a sim.
Yeah. Yeah. See,
Yeah, so a sim, and you also in one of your first staff meetings said that you studied the secrets of the millionaire mind, I think, as well, right?
yeah, you take good notes. I remember when I first got invited to what they called like a key staff meeting. And like fast forward, like they just want you in the office more. And so any way that they could like brand it in a way that seems intriguing, they're gonna do that. And like when you're like someone who loves teams like I do, I'm like, key staff, like I want the inside secrets, whatever. And it was cool because at that time, like I think most kids, unless they have a natural inclination themselves or their parents kind of thrust upon them, the concept of reading is not fun. It's just, it feels forced because you're like, you have to do it in school and it may topically be on things that you're not interested in. And so for me, when we went to this key staff meeting, part of the key staff meeting is you have like work on some skills for the role in the job, and then you would read, like the group would read out of a book that's like personal growth oriented. And so I remember the first book was T. Harv Eker, Secrets of a Millionaire Mind. And I remember some of the concepts being shared. And I'm like, why aren't they teaching me this in school? Like, this seems like the stuff that I really should be learning about and knowing. And it wasn't the same content. And it felt like, oh, these are skills and lessons that like can be applicable for the rest of my life. And like I like this. And I think when you work in a direct sales role, because it is hard, it is really uncomfortable, it forces you to grow. And so they try and get you on that on ramp pretty early of like, let's grow these youngins to be bigger than their peers almost. And that was really impactful to just like kind of begin reading books and also be interested in reading books. To get my hands on content and like, just you begin to form these habits of like one of the challenges that they offered was just to read 20 pages a day, which doesn't seem like it's like that big of a number. Like pretty much all literate humans are capable of reading 20 pages a day. And if you read 20 pages a day, you're probably going to read like 14 or 15 books a year. And
That's true.
that's like a lot more than most of the world, right? And so in my head, I'm like, who can't read 20 pages a day, right? Like, come on, that's simple enough. But it was like this bite-sized amount that was doable for me. And I also felt myself getting smarter, which is like a really good feeling. I'm like consuming this information. I'm like, oh, it's showing up in my life. And there are times when I can use this. And yeah, I think that feeling of progress, it's definitely a powerful one.
Yeah, because you're shifting your cognitive framework, right? From being an hourly kind of wage earner to one that can think strategically and this internal locus of control, self-agency, and think strategically about capital accumulation and advanced financial mechanics and just, the psychology of it all, financial habits and wealth psychology. And that would be really transformative for you. And I know that you went in and re-challenged yourself. So can you tell about that journey? Because I know your last sale was late at night and the
Yeah.
conditions were terrible, and yet you still, so it's
Yeah.
just a fascinating story.
Yeah. It is a fun one. And I like look back at those moments and just like kind of makes me smile. I'm like, you're almost like too young to like even realize what you did, like to have that naivety in some ways. But so I went to Tony Robbins event and Unleash the Power Within events, and I was 20, 20 at the time. And they asked this question of like, what's your biggest fear? And it was in November. And so this fear that I had was like, oh no, January is coming around again. Like, are people going to remember the fact that I fell on my face last January? Like, I'm really, really shy and nervous about that. And so he's like, okay, write down your biggest fears. And I'm like, I know this one. And I didn't know the question he was going to ask afterward, but just like, okay, like, how do you conquer it? I'm like, oh man, I feel like I got set up here. And so I like, oh no, like I have to like try and break this record again because like I'm so afraid of it. And there's this quote that I think is really like paradoxical and funny is that fear is the only thing that gets smaller as you run towards it. And that's how I felt. And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna like go out and like try and set the January record again. And I'm like, okay, but maybe you like don't tell anybody, right? And it's like an internal goal, and like you can just keep it to yourself, and no one will find out. And if you hit it, awesome. Like if you don't, like no one will care. And like, no, you gotta go through it. Like you gotta do it in the same way. Like you gotta put yourself out there. And so like I said, hey, I'm gonna do it. And so I did my best to like start off the year on a strong foot because like during January as college student, you have your break And so in my head, how that looked is that I was going to like sell the most that I was going to sell while I did not have my classes because I had more time. And then the back half of January, once my classes start again, I was going to have like a comfortable cushion that I was just like backfilling. And that's just not how life works for the most part. But I remember making like 1,200 phone calls before the start of the year to try and fill my calendar. And kind of fast forward, this is like it was a 5-week month that January. So I remember after the fourth, like right at the beginning of the fourth week, we had like our like year end / kickoff conference. And during that conference, I'd kind of swept all these like sales awards. And I remember I was at $32,000, which beat last year. So like, yeah, progress rate. And I remember saying to myself, like, oh my God, like I'm still 20,000, like I'm at least $20,000 plus short of this goal right now. Like I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I also had this weird thing come over me where like I'm on stage and like sweeping all these awards, and I like kind of resented the fact that everybody was blowing smoke up my ass. Like, oh man, like you're the man. And I'm like, this is not the goal. Like the goal is what this is. And like, well, it also was like a point in my life where I'm like, if these are the people I'm surrounding myself with, like I need to be around people that are thinking bigger, because if they think this is big and I don't, then like I need to be around people that are going to challenge me and push me. And so I remember going home from that event and like having this moment where I'm like, okay, you could like sail it in, right? And like work decently hard your last week and, you know, probably finish it around like $40,000. And like, guess what? That's like a 33% increase over the last time. You'll be like coasting and beating everybody else. And that's, and then I remember during the Unleash the Power Within event, Tony like briefly said, and there's a book called The Man Think It. If you haven't read it, you should pick it up. And I just like remember being at UPW and like Amazoning it to my home at that moment. And then I had all these books in my house, and like that night, I remember it was like 12 midnight, 1 a.m. And I'm just like staring at the ceiling thinking like, how am I going to do this? Like, should I even like pursue it? Is it worth it? And then I remember saying like, Michael, the version of you that worked their butt off this entire month would absolutely kick the ass of the version right now that wants to like let up. And so I was like, okay. And then I just remember like hearing Tony's voice and like almost like seeing As a Man Think It on my shelf, like glowing, like pick me up. And so luckily it's a really short book, and I read it in like an hour or two. And one of the most important concepts of that book is like the moment that doubt becomes more dense than like your thought of possibility, like you're just finished. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't let doubt creep in. And I'm like, okay, but like, how could I really get myself to a state where I believe that I can do this? Like in my bones, I feel like I can accomplish this, not like faking it, but I really need to embody this. And so I did something that I'd never done before. I basically like went back to all my old customers and asked if they would sit down with me, and just like took an approach that I never took before, which is a lesson for the rest of my life, is like a new approach often can yield like, you know, expansive performance. And so fast forward, like I had sent emails out to like all my old customers and asked them if like they wanted to sit down with me again, like before I graduated, and I would sharpen their knives. And they were like, okay. And a bunch of people responded, but like as is life, where some people like respond to a text or an email and like, they're like, yes, I'd love to see you. And then like they miss the rest of like each step on a time. Right. And so I sold $20,000 plus in a week before, only one time in my career prior. And so I had a lot of doubt that I could do it again. And that last day, I remember I needed to sell $11,000 in the day, and I had 4 appointments, and I felt good about a couple of them, but like also like didn't think that I was going to sell $11,000 on 4 appointments. And so my first appointment was at 7 a.m. and I remember getting out of my house at 6, and it's like snowing. I'm just, this is like not what I need today. Like, I don't need anybody canceling, like whatever. And so I go to that first appointment. The first time I sat down with them, they had made a $1,500 purchase. This time they bought a can opener. And I'm like, it's like really not helping me toward my goal. And it's like, I need to sell $11,000. And I just spent like an hour and a half for 50. And like, there was nothing against that customer. She's so lovely, but I like didn't feel like I was making progress towards my goal. And so then I went to the next appointment and I wound up selling like $2,500. Like, I got this boost. Feel like, okay, like maybe like I can do this. And so as I progressed, I like figured, okay, how can I use my weakness in this case as a strength? Like, think outside of the box. And what I figured out is that like the snow was coming down, and like, okay, this really sucks. But like, what edge does it offer me? And the edge was that everybody was home because no one was leaving their houses during this like snowstorm that was coming in, and I was already out. So I'm like, okay, anybody who like said that they would sit down with me, right? Like, or I was in the neighborhood and I had a past customer there, like, I'm just gonna show up and knock on the door and ask if they have time to sit down with me. And I kind of know that they do because they're like sitting at home in the snow, like kind of probably just, watching Netflix or something. And so I wound up, basically sounding like an additional, like, I was at $8,000 at 8 p.m. And so I felt good, but I had no leads. Like, I had exhorted, like I knocked on everybody's door that I could. Like, that was tapped. And so it's like 8 p.m. and snow's coming down. And I'm just like, man, like $3,000 is not small in that context. It's like what's your strategy? And there aren't many strategies to deploy at that point. And so I'm like looking through all my leads, and there was one woman, and it's not always the best indicator, but there was one woman who like made a very large purchase for me, who was like, hey, you should sit down with this woman. Like, they just moved into the home. Like, it's a big, beautiful home. Like, they'd probably be a good prospect. And, I remember taking the first call with her, and she was so lovely. And she's like, oh my God, yes, I'd love to sit down with you. Like, please just call me back at this time. I'm like, okay, cool. And I followed up with her for like a month and just never got a hold of her again after that first phone call. And like, I left a voice note, and so 8 p.m. comes. I'm like pretty close to her house, and I call her, and remember her name is Sasha Blackwell. And I'm like, hey, Sasha. She's like, oh my God, Michael, like, I got your voicemail. I was meaning to call you back. Like, what time next week can you sit down with me? And I'm like, I'm like 5 minutes away from you right now. And like, I really am close to this goal. Like, is there any way you could sit down with me right now? And she definitely had some apprehension to do like it's some blizzard and like I don't know you and you're like coming to my house on like, a Monday night. But anyway, I like just tell her I'll be there in 5 minutes and show up. And I made this promise with my college roommates and friends that like they weren't allowed to let me in the house until I broke the record. And I was like, off comms the whole day because like I just had no time to like chit chat with them. And so, yeah, the last appointment of the day, like, you know, I wound up, well, I shouldn't even say appointment because it wasn't scheduled. Like, past midnight winds up being like this $3,000 sale. And yeah, I just remember coming back to my place, like having broken this record and like my roommates celebrating me and like lifting me on their shoulders and us just having this like epic night. And it it was true what the book said, is that like I never let the doubt become more dense than like my belief in myself. And that was such a valuable lesson. Like, until the clock's at zero, like there's pretty much always a way. Like if you're willing to like think outside the box and yeah, sometimes ask people for help. It's another lesson that I've had to learn that I'm not that good at as I like control. But all those things like unmatched to this beautiful moment, which still helps me today.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so many different stories of just continual growth. And, I taught logic when I was younger, and we talk about stepwise refinement. In other words, if you have this really, what seems to be an impossible problem, you break it into incremental steps and you chew at it. And then by doing so, you can put a person on the moon. I mean, it could be fantastical. There is no barrier really. And as long as you get this mindset that you can conquer, and that's what you've done, right? You divide these things into these best practices and steps, and you execute on those steps, and guess what? You end up achieving what is considered to be impossible goals, and your whole life is really a testament to that of continual growth. And I guess where you are today, you're so successful, is to try to keep that mindset because sometimes you lose as you get older, you lose some of that that innovation, sort of fearlessness kind of mindset, right? It's sort of the innocence part of it. So I'm going to kind of compress some of this now because we've spent quite a bit of time on the first part. So I'll just kind of sort of summarize this next part. You do a relocation to Silicon Valley and to organizational leadership. This idea of almost like geographic arbitrage in the pursuit of innovation, right? And taking all of your optimized performance and behavioral mechanics and the agility and the resilience and really the dedication and the mentorship that you receive and all the books and the lessons you've learned from traditional the sales environment, and then expanding that operational theater. So you move from New York to San Francisco, which is a global epicenter for technology, venture capital, and high growth startups. And that leads to an entirely new economic paradigm. You actually shift your focus from consumer hard goods to software, digital infrastructure, venture-backed enterprise, and you get mentorship again, though, in because you weren't afraid to say, you know what, I can learn from you, and then um, people will say, oh, gee, like they're willing to say, provide guidance in essence, right? And you're like a sponge in the sense that all of these lessons you'll pick up. And so you integrate into the Silicon Valley ecosystem, operating as the director of community growth with abundant coaching organization. And it's about the facilitation of human potential and generating commercial value as an organizational catalyst. And you're continually refining your own psychological mindset and skill set because you realize there's this tremendous capability in the empowering part and the navigating to professional and personal development. And you're a student of life philosophy, right? So you realize that when you're working in that environment of startups and high growth people, but also in startups, there's this whole aspect of human motivation, behavior psychology, peak performance optimization, and you learn about that. So you continue to refine all the things you learned when you did sales, and you were so resilient, and the empathy aspect of the coaching, creating a sort of a really unique, well-rounded executive skill set that proved very invaluable. And so you then get into the founding of the profile firm. So Can you talk about that? And then from there, walking to where you are today, and that's, you're in venture capital and so on, right? So,
I think when you live in San Francisco, it just feels like the world revolves around tech and innovation. Like that's what it feels like when you're there. Like if you're at your like normal coffee shop and other parts of the world, like they're having their conversations. And if you're like in the Bay, it's like all tech, startup, innovations, venture, etc. It's like all that's talked about. In some ways, it's like enthralling, and in some ways, it's also like maybe we can talk about other things too. Is like kind of what gave me a foot out the door at one point. But I think when I first got there, I recognized that everybody kind of burned the bridge to pursue their dreams, and like I wanted to be surrounded by that energy. It's kind of what prompted the move, and I would meet all these founders and kind of talk to them and ask them like, hey, what's the hardest things that you're dealing with? And it kind of always came back to the same two things. It was talent and it was money. And like, I didn't think that I was at the time going to be able to very much help on the money front. And so I'm like, okay, like I have an idea like how to get people like through the door. And like you work with these founders, and it's so hard. Like to be a founder, it's so hard in so many different ways. Like the way I try and explain it to people is if you ever watch like the NFL, these men are moving it so fast. And sometimes you might see someone like barely touch them and knock them off balance. It's because when you're running that fast, it's really easy to get you off kilt. And so like that is basically the life of a startup. It's like you're running so fast all the time that it's just so easy to like push you off balance, because moving slow is not an option. You're never going to beat an incumbent that's already like large and established by moving slow. Like your advantage as a startup is the fact that you're nimble and can move quicker than that. Like you're not having meetings about having meetings. You're going out and like iterating as fast as possible, and you can allocate all your resources to like one problem, right? And it's just a little different. And a FANG model, which if you're a Facebook or an Apple or a Netflix or a Google, like you can't move as quickly on things because they're just like guardrails and bureaucracy when you're at a company that size. And so I love working with people at the very early stages, because like we had a conversation, like someone could go and take action on it like the second after the call ended. And like to see people do that, like you also begin to just like notice these patterns of like these founders and like the ones, and it's not perfect, right? Because like so much of like forming a successful company is timing. It's like pursuing the right product at the right time. There's a lot of that stuff to it, but you then begin to notice like the ones who usually make it, there's just this level of obsession, and you see it immediately, and it's like nothing else really matters to them other than building this thing, which we can debate whether that's healthy or not, but like that's just where they're at. And so being around, people who are just like going after their dream and like leaving it all on the table felt so aligned. And, to see many of those founders like, figure it out and also just pivot like constantly, like not have the result that they wanted and like take the feedback, and like it'd be really easy for them to quit at that moment, or really be easy for them to like sunset the company, return the money back to the investors, right? But like they just kept iterating and like eventually found product market fit. And then it like almost changes into an entirely different company once you find product market fit. Like I think you probably heard these numbers, and like there's this famous Peter Thiel book called 0 to 1. And like that's a stage of the business. And then there's like 1 to 10, and there's like 10 to 100. And all of those present such different problems. And like typically the skills that helped you succeed in that like other bucket don't lend themselves to the next stage. Like you almost have to become an entirely different company in these stages. And so it's really fascinating. Like when you begin to like, I like things that are measurable, like performance. It's really hard to improve if you can't measure it, right? And like at these companies, like all this stuff begins to shift like so quickly. And some of it's just like, it's really interesting where it's almost like, and again, I love sports. It's weird how long it took the NBA to recognize that like 3 points is more than 2 points. And now you see all these teams shooting 3 pointers, right? Because if you shoot 40% from three and you take five threes, you have 6 points. If you shoot, 50% on 2 pointers, right? It's not as many as 6 points. So it's people shifted the activity, right? Of like what is performance wise and what makes the most sense. And like to watch people experience almost like this asymmetry so quickly by like one thing, right? Like they figured out one growth engine. They figured out like one way to acquire a customer. They figured out one way to service a customer. They figured out one product that really just had such an impact. Like it was so fun to work with people that like in some ways it's good that like San Francisco is sheltered from the rest of the world because it doesn't allow like the thoughts of doubt and like risk to impact it. In some ways it's very insular, but it's a really special place to be. And if you haven't spent much time in the Bay Area, you have the opportunity to, like, it is a really cool place to experience. And just like people watch, sit down in a coffee shop, have conversations, see what matters to people, see what they're thinking about. And like, I don't live there now. I do get back there often. Like in this era, like during this AI super cycle, like the feeling in San Francisco is just, it's charged. It's really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you become really the person in the capability of the profile firm and highly specialized technical talent recruitment and architecting it and navigating, as you mentioned, the various capital life cycles, right? From seeking talent from the initial pre-seed to seed to Series A, B, C, D, et cetera. And the requirements are different. And requiring the rapid transition from this sort of visionary founders all the way to a global organizational hierarchy. You did all of that and continue to do that now, and then more the capital allocation side as well. But your company, you built this elite unicorn status, and these founders that you were able to work with, and it's just amazing. The ability to go from direct sales and human psychology, and then taking that into the founder kind of mentality and the different stages of the founder mentality, and in seed and Series A, it's highly volatile. Sometimes the product market fit is still not quite there. It's very chaotic, and yet what you're doing, you're sourcing highly adaptable, risk tolerant people with extreme resilience. And those are sort of the traits that you mirrored in direct sales, right? So establishing a functional baseline capable of sort of repeating and securing subsequent, I should say, institutional capital. You're then able to take them to series A, well into A, B, and C, rapid scaling, aggressive market penetration, acquired, system-wide capabilities. So you're transitioning the teams by recruiting specialized middle management to operationalize the founder early vision, driving predictable revenue models, predicting the core company culture from hyper growth, degradation, and then from Series D, pre-IPO acquisition, positioning global market dominance. You're then recruiting for season C operators capable of managing, the massive headcount, preparing for that public market scrutiny, and culminating in these unicorn valuations. You've done that very successfully. I would say the most successful operator in that space, and as a result, you develop a lot of respect. People would come to you, and you would get tremendous insight very early and I know, and I should do a time check here, but I know there's some where you say, I knew that this could have scaled, and for some reason I didn't pursue it, and things like that. Let me do a time check. How much more can you go over? Because we've done about an hour.
Yeah, probably like 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, so we're going to have to go more to the wrap up phase. So did I get that right in terms of what you're doing with the profile firm? Is there anything I missed? And then let's get into the flagship ventures, Access Ventures, and your work there and things like that.
Yeah, so I think it's you don't know that all these things are happening while it's going on. Like I was in my 20s and it's just like, all right, well, this is working right now, so I'm gonna do this right now because it's working right now. And I think I noticed that like, wow, each one of these stages has different things and different complexities and challenges. And like there's some like it was cool to work with some of the bigger companies, but like actually mostly from the ability to say that I worked with a bigger company, not because I like to work more. I actually very much liking working with the earlier stage companies because there was just like less red tape and like you can move faster and like that was more fun for me. And my work, I think, was felt more impactfully, right? If your team is sub 10 people, one person makes a giant difference. If your company is hundreds of people, one person makes less of an impact. And so, yeah, it was really fun and like talent as like some things have changed significantly and some things will like remain the same. And maybe this is a little bit of a hot take, but I think there's a lot of folks right now who are talking about like all these layoffs within AI. And like, I don't mean to be dehumanizing. Like it's really sad in some ways that like people are losing their work. And, also I can tell you that like, there's never been more hiring than there has been right now on the other side of that, where like, if you are willing to adopt some of these tools and like incorporate them into how you work, companies are actually paying more than they've ever paid before to have you on board. And so it is a weird dichotomy because like, again, the divergence of these two is like becoming really, really, sparse, but it's something that I only see growing at this moment because like the application of all these tools is like driving productivity in ways that we've never seen it done before.
Yeah, and because you span the entire ecosystem, right? And now you're into the capital allocation side, as I mentioned, and flex staff, I should say, flex staff ventures, access ventures, and it's a logical evolutionary step for you because you've architected these executive teams that became unicorns, and so it's a great transition to go into the capital allocation, and you provide this very valuable skill set, right? Because really human capital ultimately is the driver. And so can you talk a little bit about that? And I know you have an interest in Bitcoin or that kind of marketplace as well, because you're an early adopter. So I'd like to get your kind of opinion on where that's going at a macro level of decentralized architecture, cryptographic technologies and digital asset classes, and then Web3 decentralized finance, but where you see things going and in because now of the nature of your work.
Yeah, I think I'll start at the beginning and say that there's this like Japanese mental model called the Ikigai that it's kind of like where your skills and things that you're good at meet something that excites you, meet something that, it's a bigger contribution than yourself. And then lastly, where like if you perform, you are like given your fruits and flowers for your performance. And so I was trying to figure out what that was, and like the recruiting space didn't feel like it was offering it to me on a long-term scale. So I wanted something where like I was building and like I didn't start at zero every year. That's what it felt like at a recruiting firm. It's like I constantly had to find new clients. And, that's just like, it's not a great feeling. And like, no one values your book of business like you value it. No one values your relationships like you value them. And so I was like, well, like I'd love to be on the other side of this. If I could, like, I feel like, and everybody kind of thinks this, admittedly, I think, but it's like, well, if I was on this side, like I could identify the talent. Like I know what founders like would wind up succeeding, like I've been around a bunch of them and like, let me put that to the test. And so I think there's some level of truth to that. And it's been fun being on this side of the table, right? Because like now, truly today, like capital is a commodity. Like there's so much money that's out there that's like dedicated to go into high growth companies in tech. Like people know that it has the highest possibility for asymmetry. So like guess what? People are trying to find asymmetry where they can. But I think we are experiencing it in ways that we've never seen before because we've never seen growth this fast. Like if you were to look at OpenAI and Anthropic, like two model companies that everybody's talking about, like ChatGPT launched November 30th of 2022 and like had like 1 million users in like 7 days. Like we had never seen anything like that before. And then like on the other side of the coin, like Anthropic has grown 10x, 10x, 10x. That has never happened at the numbers that they experienced. Like, because scale usually doesn't work that way, right? You can't just like double, 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 double. Like that doesn't really work out, but they've been able to do that to date. And so, yeah, I'm super bullish on where we're headed. And I think the conversation of like, is this an AI bubble comes up all the time. And I understand why. But if you were to look at the behavior of bubbles, it actually always starts with the same thing. There's usually a huge step function in technology that creates the hype. The internet as an example, right? Of course, there's a lot of companies that came out of the internet era that are great investments for people. And there are a lot that didn't materialize. This feels a little different because these companies are actually doing revenue. And it always feels different. I'll highlight that too. Every bubble, you're asking yourself the same questions. But if we're looking at like the TAMs that this is attacking, it's all addressable market. Like we haven't even really deployed AI in the physical world, which is way bigger than the digital world. And look at the size of these companies to date. So if I was to ask you, do you think our future is going to be more AI driven or less? I think most people would say more. If that's the case, and I know I'm simplifying here, but like, then it probably leads that a lot of these things are going to continue to grow. That doesn't mean that you should just be throwing money around left and right. Like, but the biggest companies, I think, are going to be the biggest companies you've ever seen. Every super cycle, you kind of add a zero to the market cap of these companies. And, you know, there are $1 trillion companies now. Like no one thought that was possible so long ago, right? And now there are several $1 billion companies. And I think we'll see our first $10 trillion company, you know, probably within the next couple of years. And like no one thought that that was possible. Or you're adding another zero to that side of the ledger. To speak on crypto specifically, I'm less involved than I once was. I did, you know, kind of buy my first Bitcoin at a young age, but some of that's luck, some of that's pursuit, and you know, really a friend that put me on. And I think I like to focus less on crypto, more on blockchain. Like the tech is there, and we're not seeing it, but it's happening all over the place. Like banks are beginning to integrate these types of technologies. Like payment rails are like being reconstructed. Stable coins are like being used on both sides of the ledger for like giant banks and corporations. It's just less noisy than it once was because like a lot of these types of things are like kind of boring that just like needed a facelift, and now there's better technology that exists, and like it's not the same thing. It's like, oh my God, I invested in Bitcoin at like this price and now it's up to this, right? Like I think there's maybe less of that in the future, right? That's had its day. And like, again, if you invested pretty early, you're in really good shape. But I think it's more the underlying tech that is still like yielding lots of excitement. And I don't know what those applications are going to be in the future, but I imagine, again, they're going to be supercharged by AI. Like the broad mandate of what AI can apply to, it's just like, that's what makes it special, is like, it's not like AI can change everything, and it is like AI can change everything. It's like this really weird way that there's so many things that it can impact.
Yeah, before we get to the last question, and I encourage the audience to just research this. So they should research further you and and your venture group, and your chief of staff Abby, and you got Robert as a venture partner, I believe, and Craig. I mean, just amazing backgrounds, right? And to the audience, if they want to see where things are going, follow what you're doing, and where you're making investments and things like that. And then just kind of off the top of my head, so I need the audience do your own kind of due diligence and research. But I read, that JP Morgan, they put 1.5 trillion they're making in investments. I mean, that's incredible. You have SpaceX, their seed round was 20 million. Now they're heading towards 2 trillion. Anthropic, just a few years ago, their initial round was 550 million valuation. They're heading to 1 trillion. I know that Vinod Khosla, they keep putting 50 million in 2019. They're heading to 1 trillion. If you look at, let's see, NVIDIA, and if you bought their stock, let's say in 2015, I think it was about 20 billion. Now they're, 5 point something, 5.x trillion they've hit right this year. It's just, as you mentioned, incredible numbers, right? Where things are going. Mm-hmm. And you're at the center of that. You see things early, you're at the center of it. You're an amazing, accomplished venture in so many different ways, because so many dynamics to this. And this leads to maybe last couple of questions, your reflections on some of those numbers. And then the last question would be, what would be your recommendations to the audience? And what questions would you want to leave the audience?
Yeah, I think I'm not a public markets guy, so I want to make sure that I highlight that. I know the private markets pretty well, and I know the private tech markets pretty well. It's a bubble and silo within a silo, but I just highlight that because I don't meet many people who know so much about every topic, and God bless those people. But I think, yeah, first of all, I have so much respect for Jensen Huang, and he founded NVIDIA in the 90s. It wasn't an overnight success. And he had a very successful business and decided to entirely pivot it to pursue this AI vision. I don't think people talk about that enough, of how much guts that takes to risk it all for the vision of the future.
Right.
And you were already successful. And now it's the biggest company in the world. So that's one thing that stands out to me in what you said. I think in the numbers, we're still so early. The penetration of AI, within the average consumer and enterprise is nowhere close to where it's going to be. And so if I was to say one thing to people, it's just play around with this stuff, right? We're so lucky because these companies have subsidized our usage. They continue to spend so much money so we can have these things pretty cheap. And there are projects that you thought would probably cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to build that you can now build yourself for tens of dollars, which is just such a shift. And in the past, it's two things. It's money and it's time. It used to cost so much and it used to take so long. Both of those things have been eliminated, where if you're not that technical, you can build things. You used to have to code in ones and zeros. Now I can code in English. There's such a jump that I didn't know that we'd ever experience in our lifetime. And it's here and it's moving faster than ever. And so whether it's, a Codex or a Claude Cowork, use these tools. Those are the two ones that I recommend the most because it's the simplest. And just tinker, mess around. Who cares? Fail, right? Hey, try and build something. Try and build an app for yourself. And make it. This is just the easiest one in my head. Is make it a personal goal app, right? Hey, I'm gonna track these things, daily habits. Build it, mess up, work through the problem, and see what it's like on the other side, because it's never been a better time to build than it is right now. But you're still going to experience failure just like anything else, and work through it. You're going to be better for it. And if you don't, you might be shown up by people that are like choosing to integrate this and taking it seriously.
I mean, even Dario says that, by the end of this year, there'll be just a person running a unicorn company and potentially could have AI do the rest, right? I mean, just incredible. And you're at the hub of this as well. So are any other questions you want to leave the audience where, questions they should ponder?
Yeah, I think for me, something that gets thrown around a lot are books. Right? What's your favorite book recommendation? And like, I think it's a useful framework, but the way that I kind of like sidestep that conversation, whenever someone asks me like, what's like a book that I should read, like what's something that you've read that's changed your worldview or has impacted the daily behavior? And because those two things to me are really hard. It's really hard to change someone's mind about how they view the world. And it's really hard to get someone to do something every day. And so I would like pose that same thing in this realm of like, can you commit to just like tinkering around with one of these LLMs every day? Just like have it open, ask it questions, risk with it, right? Like let it get to know you. You get to use it. Nothing's a dumb question. Explore it, pursue it. And I think the other question I would leave is like, can you ask yourself, I've tried to train myself to do this, like genuinely, like, can AI do this? And there's just like so many times where the answer is yes. And you're like, oh, wow. Like, then let it do it. Right. So you can free up a lot of your time if you're just like willing to explore some of these tools, which that does take a little bit of an upfront cost. But like, once you get past the upfront costs, it's like hours and hours of your time back.
So, Michael, again, in gratitude for you for taking over an hour with me and exploring so many different areas. And you're just a phenomenal figure, a pioneer, an icon that people should model and learn from and follow your work and your colleagues as well. So thank you for coming in and sharing your
Thank you, Stephen.
with my audience.
Thank you, Stephen. It was great to see you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.